That woman's laughing too loud.
No, the late night.
Is it recording? Isn't there usually a red dot when it's recording?
Hello, everyone. I hope you've all found a good, comfortable seat so you can enjoy this evening. Okay, thank you. Good evening, and thank you for joining us here at the Homer Public Library's Fireplace Lounge. I'm Cheryl Ilg. I'm the coordinator for the Friends of the Homer Public Library, and I'm pleased to be here with you all tonight in honor of Alaska Book Week to hear from two of our well-known Homer authors, Tom Kizzia and Richard Chiappone. Alaska Book Week is a statewide celebration coordinated by the Alaska Center for the Book, that annually celebrates the multifaceted ways that we appreciate books. From readings to panels, lectures, discussions, and youth activities. This year, the Alaska Book Week takes place October 1st through October 8th. To learn more and view this year's schedule of events, go to alaskabookweek.org. Before introducing our guests, I want to thank the Homer Public Library, the amazing library staff, and our hardworking library director, David Berry, for allowing us to use this beautiful facility and host tonight's author talks. I want to also thank our Friends of the Homer Public Library members and donors for your support. Your generosity helps us provide events like this and so much more. If you'd like to become a member or renew your membership, please go to our website or fill out an application up front. Another big thank you goes out to the Homer Bookstore. Tonight, they are selling copies of our guest authors' books, and they may be purchased at the end of this talk. Thank you, Sue and the bookstore, for being here. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's guest authors, Tom Kizzia and Richard Chiappone, who will discuss their latest books as well as their experiences as writers. Tom Kizzia arrived in Homer in 1975 after graduating from Hampshire College to become editor of the Homer Weekly News. He reported for the Anchorage Daily News from Anchorage in the 1980s and beginning in 1989 was the statewide newspaper's Homer Bureau for 20 years. He is the author of 3 nonfiction books, The Wake of the Unseen Object, Pilgrim's Wilderness, and his new work, Cold Mountain Path, The Ghost Town Decades of McCarthy-Kennecott, Alaska. He has received an Artist Fellowship from the Rasmussen Foundation and was a Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. In recent years, his journalism has appeared in The New Yorker, the Columbia Journalism Review, and in Best American Science and Nature Writing. Richard Chiappone is a 4-year Alaskan and a 20-year full-time resident of the Lower Kenai Peninsula. He is the author of the novel, The Hunger of Crows, and 3 collections of short stories and personal essays. His work has appeared in Alaska Magazine, the Anchorage Press, Playboy Magazine, The Sun, and many other journals. He is a former senior associate editor at Alaska Quarterly Review and a longtime organizer of the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference. He is also the winner of the 2021 Alaska State Foundation for the Arts and Culture and Grant, one of 2 Homer winners, the other being Linda Martin. He currently teaches in the Masters of Fine Arts program at the University of Alaska Anchorage and lives here in Homer with his wife, 3 fish, and 1 cat. Thank you both for being here tonight, Tom Kizzia and Richard Chiappone.
Thank you, Cheryl. We're just going to remain seated so we're not up and down. Up and down, you feel like we're at a Catholic Mass or something. And just talk from here. Can you hear my loud mouth in the back? Lori, Tom, that's been you guys. All right. All right. Okay. Good, good. Thanks for coming out. We're pleased to be here. And I thank the Friends of the Library for making this possible, and also the staff of the library, as Cheryl said. I'm not sure what Cheryl said when she read it, but I thought she said I was a 4-year resident of Alaska. So it's a 40-year resident. So that's okay. I'm a fiction writer. I don't hold people to facts. I really don't. But that's a little off, even for me. Probably magical realism or something.
We did this in December. We sat down and
Yeah.
talked, and it wasn't recorded, so we couldn't remember. We were saying, what did we say? Am I gonna tell the same bad jokes, or?
It's never stopped me.
Right. But anyway, as I was saying, when I was so rudely interrupted in December.
Yeah, right. Held that against me for a year now. Right. Yeah, like as Tom was saying, our books both came out within a few weeks of each other. Late last fall. Mine in November, and yours was in October or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we were here in December talking about it, and we thought that tonight we'd do a couple different things. One thing is, now we've had an opportunity for the past 10 months or so, 11 months, whatever it's been, to get some feedback from readers and the public. And we thought we'd talk a little bit about some of the responses that we've heard from about the books, and we'll see if anybody else has any complaints to follow. There should be a complaint box somewhere. That way you could ignore them. Those are great because nobody ever looks in those. So that's one thing we'll do. And then another thing that we'd like to do tonight is talk, and Tom's idea was maybe talk about some books that we've admired for the way those authors treat the world of their story. Because our books are both about Alaska, set in Alaska, and other authors have done great work in other.
Yeah, I was thinking of the books that in particular have, inspired me to do the books that I did. Like,
okay.
When I'm writing, if I kind of am just hitting a blank wall and I have to escape, and I'll go, what do I go read and lose myself in until the gears start to turn again. So talk about that a little bit, because I thought we could talk about writing in a more general sense tonight and not try to sell our books. So the way we did in December.
Everyone here has bought our books. We know that
Right,
everyone
yeah.
here has bought our books. Right. No one would show up here who hasn't bought our books, I'm sure. Well, along those lines, talking about responses, the one that I've heard a couple of times about my book, did I even bring my book?
I think they have some in the back.
Here it is. Yeah, it should have some in the back. Was a kind of I don't want to say a complaint, but some concern about the fact that it ends in a way that some reviewers found less than satisfying. The review, the Publishers Weekly review that came out just prior to publication is always an important marketing tool for writers and publishers. And that reviewer liked the book a lot. She said all kinds of nice things about it, and I was really happy reading it until I got to the very end. And they said everything was wonderful, 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 except for the ending, which was ambiguous, was the word they used. And they were they'd taken offense at that, or didn't like that very much, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, because after spending 30 years writing and reading and being a student of short stories, that's exactly what you're aiming for most of the time. The idea that literary fiction is never adamant about anything. It's always ambiguous. Art is supposed to be something open to interpretation, and ambiguity is kind of what we shoot for. Well, I didn't realize that, and this was marketed as a crime novel because there is sexual violence and cool stuff like that in it. And because I tried to sell a few books this time. I've proven again and again I can write books that no one will buy. And I just thought that this time I'd write something more commercial. And I forgot to allow for the fact that readers of commercial writing want everything wrapped up nice and tight in the end. if you want to know a better example maybe of the difference I'm talking about, is the difference between like the TV series that are on Netflix and HBO and so forth now. They tend to be very ambiguous. The endings, you never know exactly what it's about sometimes. And, it's not just good guys and bad guys, easily spelled out. You get a long running show, 6 or 7 years running, like Breaking Bad, for example. And in the end, it's debatable whether Walter White ever redeemed himself for all the bad things that he did, or whether or not he was justified in getting into it. And you can argue about it. But if you watch a show like, I don't know, Magnum PI or something, the network television, there's no question at the end of it that the bad guys go into jail and the good guys done it again. He's a hero. And I think it's sickening. I can't watch network TV of any kind. I mean, just can't. It's just horrifying that they do that. So my ending was left a little open-ended. For those of you who have read the book, well, here's an example. My brother, who's a pretty literal guy, not literary guy, just the opposite, literal guy, complained that he wanted to know what happened to, is Cosmo D'Angelo alive or dead? And I've had several people, numerous people actually ask me, did that guy die, that character in the book? And because it's not clear whether or not he was mortally wounded, very seriously wounded, and I left that open. There's a question of whatever happened to Carla, the main character, the woman who kind of in the end goes off and you're not sure if she's going to be okay or not, where she's going with it. And that's left open. And probably the most compelling question for most people was whether or not the local guy, Scott Crockett, the carpenter, is going to get rid of his tidy ways and buy some colorful underpants. I know that a lot of people worry about that.
Yeah. Well, I just figured that, like I was saying, it's the ambiguity there was just leaving it open for season 2.
That's right. That's how you set up a sequel. That's right.
Right.
Exactly.
That's what they do.
So you're going to have to buy another book to find out the answers to those compelling questions.
Right. Well, they always leave cliffhangers, right?
Now, you're working fine. One of the things we always talk about is the difference between writing in the nonfiction world, Tom's world of journalism, and now his recent book is more like history writing. Is that different than reportage, or is it?
I was reporting history.
You're
Yeah,
reporting
so it was
history, okay.
It was kind of a hybrid, right?
I was a reporter for many years and dealing with the facts. And now in history, of course, the ending can't be terribly ambiguous. We kind of know who won the War of 1812 and so forth. You can't leave that too open-ended.
Right.
So how do you get nuance into your work? Where is it?
Yeah, I was remembering there was a book editor I talked to who was saying journalists are hard to work with on books because they always let the facts get in the way of the story.
Oh, I hate that. Yeah, you don't want to do that.
So, but it's in the shaping of the story, that I was trying to, I didn't really get reactions to my book like you did, saying that, wishing the ending had been otherwise, but I had actually in some ways the more profound interjections came early in, when people read the manuscript, some friends.
Oh yeah,
people,
that's another one. Right, yeah.
They were there were some sensibilities that I needed to
Like what
be
does that mean?
thoughtful of. Well, within the community, it was kind of it started out as a community story,
right?
And a few of the well, there was, for instance, there's the story of the disappearance of Cora Anderson, who was
I remember that.
she was a woman who kind of vanished in the late 70s, and a lot of people in town thought maybe her husband had something to do with it.
Okay.
And I had talked to her daughter at some length about the whole situation. And the daughter was one of the few kids who grew up in the town, and all the kids who had grown up in the town were people I had talked to. And so they were kind of defensive of Kathy, and they wanted me to be careful about how I dealt with that. But obviously it was a big issue. She was on her way to divorce court, and she disappeared and was never seen again.
Ooh, yeah.
And she was going into divorce court to increase her request for what she wanted to get out of the divorce. So, but the husband was in town at the time, in McCarthy. And so I think the first version of the draft that I had shown people was one of the few places where I was a little snarky. I was sort of making a little fun of the situation. And so I had to kind of tone that. It was more a matter of tone. Also, there was one, I didn't have many flashbacks into history of the town from its mining boom days, but I did have one story that was an amazing story of the murder of a prostitute in Old McCarthy. And I had stuck that in there as a sort of violence against women kind of story. But when you put it in the context of this other woman disappearing, it really kind of leaned on the scales in a way. So I took that out and put it somewhere else. And, changed the ending and gave Kathy the last word. And so those were kinds of changes that I made to avoid having to pay the price when the book came out, and everybody got really upset with me.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because this of course is a fiction, and in the beginning I have a disclaimer that says, although the town of Homer, Alaska is a very real place, numerous liberties have been taken for the sake of storytelling and in the interest of privacy. That's what you're talking about, privacy, real people. Some of the geographical details of the land and the sea, most of the business names and their relative locations on the Homer Spit or around the town, and all of the characters in this work of fiction are entirely made up. Any resemblance to real places or people, living or dead, is pure dumb luck. So, it could be bad luck though. The one comment that I'm going to get back to the idea of the responses and what you're talking about is several people were mostly wildly entertained. Well, this is a bit of a complex situation suddenly here. The problem is the people I know who talk to me about the book are typically literary people. They're people who come to this library, and they're people who read lots of books and good books. And so their comments may not represent a wide variety. I didn't hear from the other readers out there, but the ones who have come were wildly entertained by my sometimes hyperbolic descriptions of Anchor Point.
Right.
Those of you who have read the book are laughing. I got a hilarious email from Jay Bechtel, who's a good friend here in town and a writer. He was reading the book, and it's just 2 words in the email, and with that big exclamation point. Toothless woodcutters! Exclamation. There's a character in the story. Now, see, I hide behind my characters. I never said such a thing, and if my characters are saying this stuff, and one of the characters, who's described as a bit of a snob, highly educated person, a homestead girl who's been here all her life, but got a lot of education, says at some point, the cost of land in Homer, housing in Homer is so expensive that pretty soon everybody's gonna have to go up to Anchor Point and live with the toothless woodcutters. And so that's just a snide comment. Well, bear in mind, Lynn and I, my wife and I, lived in Anchor Point for 13 years. And we built a home there over a period of 30 years. We bought land in Anchor Point near the Anchor River in 1984 or something, and we just sold it a few years ago. So we're longtime Anchor Pointers. There's no question about it.
But that was more of a reflection about that character and her attitude than it was about objective truth, right?
We have all our teeth.
Oh, we have all our team.
So did the Anchor Point Chamber of Commerce pass any resolution?
I don't know.
I actually had a resolution condemning me passed once by the Cold Bay Chamber of Commerce.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What did
yeah.
you say about them?
Well, I went to Cold Bay. I was doing a story and just about the place. And everybody I ran into told me a different Cold Bay joke.
Oh,
Because they're sort of the self-deprecating humor is kind of the way to get through
and you
the.
thought they wanted to hear, see that?
And so I
right?
compiled them all into a
Oh.
single story.
Dumb idea. Jeez.
They didn't like the finished one, but
Oh, I can never get enough Cold Bay jokes, you know. So yeah, so the anchor point thing, I mean, some of it was to set up the criminal activity in the story. There's some bad guys, and I had to give some background. How I had to deal with a plot in which there was going to be some violence and shooting, gunfire, and in order to do that, I had to establish that gunfire in Anchor Point is not that unusual. And so there's a moment in the story where when the main character Carla first arrives in Anchor Point with the local guy, there's this loud explosive gunshot nearby, really nearby, and she jumps out of her skin, and he said, "Don't worry about it. Just somebody down the road is sighting in a rifle or shooting someone's dog, and hopefully not shooting the owner of the dog, you know, like that." He's making a joke out of it. He says, "You'll hear gunshots up here at Anchor Point, you know, so that later when there is a big gunfight, the reader isn't saying, well, how come, you know, people aren't calling the police and like that." And yeah, in all the years we lived up there was, you know, occasional gunfire, because there was always one more stop sign or road sign that needed to be shot. You know, you can never shoot enough of those at Anchor Point. So I don't know that chamber at Anchor Point has a chamber of commerce. I'm not sure. I'm not sure they have any commerce in Anchor Point. There's Thurman's.
yeah.
All of this does bring up the question of how you describe the world of your story, you know, the setting of the story, and how much of it you want to describe. Somewhere in, oh, wait, let me pull this in. This is there's a wonderful book called "A Swim in a Pond in the Rain." It's George Saunders. It's his exegesis analysis of some Russian short stories that are all my favorites. But he talks about here. This is Saunders talking now about this story by Chekhov, in which there's a woman in a cart on the road. It's called The Cart. And at some point in the middle of the story, there's a description of the road. And Saunders says, why does a story even need these kinds of descriptions of you know, just mundane stuff about the trees and the road and all? Why did Chekhov decide to pull us out of the central action and describe the world outside of the cart? One of the tacit promises of a short story, because it is so short, is that there is no waste in it. Which, you know, this makes me crazy in reading novels. And it was a real problem writing a novel. I got used to like 30 years of listening to this kind of advice and believing it myself and giving it and forcing it on my poor students, that everything has to matter in a short story. I mean, that goes back to Edgar Allan Poe. He said that 200 years ago, 150 years ago anyway. So when I read a novel, I'm always irritated. And the poor people some of the people who are in my book club, and they've heard me go off on every writer you can imagine. And we only read like classics, so they're all famous writers and not like somebody's making a mistake. So I'm picking on Tolstoy, you know. It's like, who's going to edit Tolstoy? Me. Because there's all these pages of stuff that could be yanked out, and it wouldn't stop the story. It wouldn't change the story, the outcome of the story, which makes me insane. So this is Saunders again talking about this one story. He says, everything in it is there for a reason in a short story, even a brief description of a road. So as we enter this description, we're asking ourselves somewhere in the back of our reading mind, how is this description of the road going to turn out to be essential, i.e. not wasteful? And he talks about how this works. He says, what's the value of doing that kind of describing? Are there some laws in fiction, things that our reading mind just respond to? Physical descriptions seem to be one such thing. Who knows why? We like hearing our world described, and we like hearing it described specifically. Two men in green sweaters were playing catch beside a wrecked car is better than saying I drove through the area that was sort of bland and didn't notice much. It's true. I remember our students will write, and they want to really create this air of mystery, and they'll say, it was impossible to describe the something, something, something. And I think, hello, it's kind of your job to describe whatever this is. You can't, that doesn't work. A specific description like a prop in a play helps us believe more fully in that which is entirely invented. The story, make believe fiction, right? It's sort of cheap, or it's even kind of at least an easy authorial trick. If I'm going to try to put you in a certain invented house, I might invoke a large white cat stretching itself out to what seemed like twice its normal length on a couch in that house. If you see the cat, the house becomes real. And so I had to at times put in the details about the story here, Alaska, or set in local southern Kenai Peninsula. And in this part of the book, well, the other thing to bring up is each of these chapters is from the point of view of the individual character. There's 4 different point of view characters in the book. So what you're hearing here is the interpretation of what's being seen by a different character. And this is Carla, who is the female character who's from out of state. She's only been here a short time. So she's never been on the old Sterling before. They're driving on the old Sterling, and Scott is driving. And this is what I wrote. The secondary road is even curvier than the highway, winding around marshy ponds dotted with lily pads. In one lush green puddle, a moose stands ankle deep in the shallows as if posing for a calendar, sloppy water weeds dripping from its jaws. Yearling bull, Scott says. He's the local guy. He knows what he's saying. See the little nubby antlers poking out by its ears. Carla says, do you hunt? Well, I used to all the time, moose, caribou, only small game for the past few years, grouse mostly. He stops and thinks. Last year, I don't think I got out at all. But you own a gun, she says. Guns, plural, he says. Rifles, shotguns. He chuckles. In Alaska, if you don't have at least 5 guns, you're not allowed to own property or vote. Carla nods, thinking to herself. That's a joke, Carla, Scott says. I know that, she says. I'm just glad you have a gun. So she's just finding out if she has weapons on hand in this house because she's being pursued by a dangerous character who's a former CIA gunslinger, that kind of guy, who may or may not be dead, as we know.
Well, I think your point about the description coming through the eyes of the characters is an important one, and it's one that I tried to use that technique in nonfiction
in your book
as well. Because the story is about the reader engages with the lives of the people, and so as the story moves forward, it really helps to describe the descriptions of the land as seen through those characters adds to the character's story.
Oh yeah.
Compared to writing a general description in an authorial voice.
Right.
So, I mean, that's like, I think where you do it, I was going to say, you've got D'Angelo up at the Baycrest Overlook describing Kachemak Bay.
But he's an out of town. He's an outsider.
Right. But this is kind of at the end when he's critically wounded.
That's right.
And this sort of made me think maybe he's sort of saying goodbye to the planet with this lovely description. He forces himself to peer out the windows and assess his environment the way he's been trained. The tranquility of the place is frightening. I like that. The sun is high in the northwest, hours of daylight yet to go, the sky cloudless again for the moment. Beneath it, the sea is silver blue and flatter than he's seen it at any time since arriving. Ant-like boats crawl across the silky surface, trailing strings of sunlit diamonds in their wakes. The lonely cone of an island volcano, a perfect Mount Fuji replica, seems to quiver on the waves. On the far shore, the mountains stand watch, a white serrated horizon. Maybe if you had sort of written that on the first page as the author, would kind of take, okay, what's happening? But when this guy is like bleeding out on the front, seat of his rental car, it takes on a different meaning.
Yeah. That chapter's 30. So half of the characters, two of them are from out of town, so they're new here. So when you see through their eyes, you're seeing Homer and Alaska through the eyes of out of towners or new people. And the other two are Scott Crockett, the carpenter's been here most of his life. And then George Volker, the bar owner, who has also been here all his life. Tom, in his book called Mountain Path, he doesn't have characters per se, but you do have real people. I mean, and
I
that's
think of them as characters. I had to develop them.
Yeah, but you can't make up stuff like I can.
It's true.
Yeah.
So I think I said last time we talked that it's sort of like the line about Ginger Rogers had to do everything that Fred Astaire did except backwards and in high heels.
In high heels.
Right, but so the nonfiction writer has to, put the jigsaw together with real pieces.
Yeah,
Doesn't
wow.
get to invent. So
Yeah, that's
in some ways it's harder, but the same. You're trying to do the same thing. You're trying to build a narrative that people turn the page to find out what's going to happen to the characters, and they are characters in the sense that the reader doesn't know anything more about them than you put on the page.
That's true. They could just as well be made up.
They have to.
And a lot of
have the same-
nonfiction writers do that. I've gotten in a lot of trouble for doing that too.
Well, I don't know that that's true. A lot of people do know the characters in your book.
Laura, you have to take your mask off, at least when you yell.
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
Because what you just said was that, what you said was that people don't know the characters except what you put on the page, but in his case, many people did know the characters.
Well, a few,
Well, a few.
and that was really, that's a really interesting challenge for me as a writer was, who was I writing for? Was I writing for people
Right.
who, were going to be interested in everything about McCarthy, and then so like anything that I put down would be of interest to them? Or was I writing for people who didn't know anything about Alaska, but were just going to get drawn into this story about an interesting place, at which point you really start sifting out a lot of side stories. And so I was trying not to write just for the people who, as far as readers, who already knew and could fill in the blanks themselves. On the other hand, the fact that these people could come up and, slash my tires at the end by the footbridge if they didn't like what I wrote, did give it a certain extra twist to the choices I was making.
What, yeah.
Tom, didn't you originally say that your impetus for writing the book, going ahead with it, was because the people of McCarthy wanted it read after Pilgrim?
Yeah. I mean, that was the origin. So I had a
Did you
kind of.
hear Kathy's question in the back?
Could you repeat the question?
She was asking if I had the original impetus for the book was that the community itself wanted to know more about that, have something written about that historical period after the Pilgrim book, because I had written about the history and then taken it out of the Pilgrim family book in order to really to focus on the family story. And so we're sort of with that blessing that I started the project, and so that helped a little bit in terms of access to people, but it was also just the time of life of the community that people realized the stories were fading. It was we had to tell the stories now or they'll never get recorded again.
Well, you're saying blessing, and I think that that's really important in that you had their blessing ahead of time to do it. You had their trust and how you'd portray people that they cared about. And that's, as being an author, I would think that would have been a really nice gift for doing it.
It's nice, but it's also, the author wants to be off in his desk telling the story that he wants to tell. So, to have an obligation to a community when you're writing, that was a different feeling for me. And I guess even for 25 years reporting for the Anchorage Daily News, I always knew that I had to, I had a community that I was writing for. And, you know, that the wake of the unseen object, writing about Bush, Alaska and the villages. As I say in the introduction there, I always knew somebody could come up to me at the next Alaska Federation of Natives meeting and say, why did you say that about our community? So, you know, I was aware that it was, that I could get feedback, you know, negative feedback, but that's kind of, you learn, you also thicken your skin as a reporter, and you know that if you want to tell the truth, sometimes people are not going to be happy about it. So I had that, that training going into this story. And that's why I say I was sort of like reporting on history rather than writing straight history. And it was partly because nothing had really been, no historians had dug up this material. So I had to interview people and work with primary sources, letters and journals and other people's interviews to patch all of this information together.
And because Tom had already written Pilgrim's Wilderness, which is a much more of a narrative. I mean, it's a nonfiction book, but it tells a story that is a more cohesive, unified story. The McCarthy book, this one called Cold Mountain Path, is more episodic in the way it covers a period of time. And yes, it's intertwined. It's almost like those linked story collections where the same characters show up from time to time in different stories. But because you had some familiarity and some really great experience with narrative, with storytelling, this book doesn't read like simple history. It reads like a story too. And you just mentioned offhand, to keep the reader reading, you've got to say the next interesting thing that makes them want to keep going. And descriptions of places are not it. And so you have to intersperse them with other things, including the personalities of the people who are describing the place, which is something I thought you did great. And I was talking to Tom about this the other day when we were fishing. And another thing, that the difference between fiction writing and nonfiction writing is, I'm not in my book in any way, shape, or form. There's no I, me, mine, first person narration in my book. It's all third person. But in Tom's book, it starts out, he talks about going out there as a very young reporter, and you're in your 30s at the time, in 1983, yeah, to report for the Anchorage Daily News on a shooting, the mass murder out there on the airport at McCarthy. And then he leaves. He's not in the story at all, and you hardly hear him mention himself at all. And there's one place here, and this again is in the very early 20 pages in, where he says, Jim Edwards, who's a McCarthy local person who lived through that time period, once told me, this is because Tom, that is said because Tom interviewed these people over and over again. Jim Edwards you knew for many years, right? You talked to him a lot of times. Once told me that on the afternoon, he flew into the Wrangell Mountains for the first time and spotted the ghost town on the valley floor. He knew that he had found a home. He had been living there for 30 years when I met him in 1983. So this is Jim Edwards talking about this valley, the McCarthy Chittenden River Valley. When Jim first saw it in 1953, give or take. The first flight from Cordova in his two-seat Taylor craft, small airplane, took several hours. He never lost the thrill of his first impression, banking away from the Copper River into the wide valley of its biggest tributary, the Chittenden. The glacier-fed rush of the river, the braided channels and gravel bars, miles of forest reaching to mountains on either side. It was a valley so big you could drop a small eastern state into it. Ahead in the far distance, a defiant wall of white. To his left, the snowy summits of the Wrangell Mountains. The higher he flew, the bigger they loomed. The massif of Mount Blackburn, 16,390 feet, the fifth tallest peak in the United States, spilled a broad moraine-striped glacier into the valley. Just beyond the glacier's terminus, seemingly vulnerable to erasure by one short surge of ice and rock, a small but dauntless settlement was perched beside the outlet river. It's a beautiful description of it. And, you know, it's Jim Edwards has told Tom that that's what it looked like. But of course, Tom's writing this
I added a few things.
Yeah.
But I had to do, it's like a cinematic opening, where you kind of come in and you
Yeah,
see
a
the
long shot.
valley. So I
Sure.
felt like I needed to orient the stranger who's coming there for the first time. But I didn't want to just have a static paragraph of description.
Mhm. Well, you could only do that because you, of course, have seen it yourself.
Mhm.
That would be the other question. And now somebody could have interviewed Jim Edwards and heard his description of that valley, but could not have written it like that because the writer would have had to have seen that place and have those feelings.
Two things about that I can say. One is that even though this book was much more, as you said, episodic than the Pilgrim family book, I really wanted it to be a book with a beginning, middle, and end, and so Jim Edwards is kind of the character whose life gives it a spine. So I really needed to emphasize him at the beginning. I meet him in the opening there when I came out to report on the murders. He was the person who I had a conversation with there on the airstrip, and his wife had just been killed. And at the end of the opening, he sends me off to convey the news of his wife's death to his son, who was in Anchorage and hadn't heard the news yet. So, he's a big part of the opening.
Yeah.
And then I kind of tell a little bit of background history in that chapter. And then in this chapter here, I wanted to get back to Jim Edwards to kind of tell the reader, this is the Jim Edwards story. This is going to, this will carry you through to the end. And in fact, the epilogue is his memorial. So
Right.
there was that. So he was important. The other thing is that, and so that was why I wanted to see it through his eyes. And also he was a character who could sort of, when he landed there, first people he met were people who had been there since the last train left. So that he was kind of a personal connection back to the old days. The other thing is that I came in there and said, Jim Edwards told me this in the opening sentence of that chapter. And then I drop out entirely until the very end of the book. And so that was like a way to remind the reader that I'm telling this story. And as I was saying the other day, it's like one of my favorite novels is Madame Bovary, which nobody sort of remembers. It's in first person plural. There's the first chapter is we, the students in this school, were struck by this new kid, Charles Bovary, who shows up, and then we just disappears and they never show up again, and tells this whole famous novel in seeming third person. But it seemed important to remind the reader that I'm coming back, and then I just left the story to Jim Edwards to tell it from there.
Yeah, and as Tom said, if you haven't said it, really the book ends in the funeral for Jim Edwards or that day.
And I was there.
Right. Again.
So again, it's
Right,
back in
right.
first person.
Jim Edwards is a great character to have because he is articulate in his own right. And when Tom does quote him in quote marks, from Jim's own mouth, he can be very entertaining too. He's talking about this guy named Gordon Burdick. No, is it Gordon? Yeah, Gordon Burdick. And this is Jim Edwards speaking now in quotes here from. Basically, Gordon made his living here for 25 years by talking. He never at any time produced anything, Jim Edwards recalled. Gordon mined a fraction up at the Jumbo mine and at the Green Butte for a lot of years. Mined, I say, mined. He was not really a prospector and not really a miner. He could get on a cat and spend 5 years building a road that was already there. Building a road that was already there to someplace that he didn't need to go to. This guy spent like 15 years going up and down this one road that no one ever got to use. It was just him driving his bulldozer around. He's described It was Burdick, right? He was described as
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
pot smoking, cat skinning raconteur. That's it. I just love that. Only in Alaska can you pull that off. Or, I mean, in the Old West, it sounds like the guys, from the 1800s in the West, the promoters and the scam artists and the guys who made a living talking.
Yeah, in terms of reactions, one of my favorite reactions to this was the one that Heather Lendy said to NPR, that a lot of us feel like we're losing something in Alaska, and this book sort of captures what we feel like we're losing. There was like that period that's
Some pot smoking cat skinners, we're losing them.
Right, I know.
They're aging out. They're driving Subarus now. It's a shame. It's a pity, really. I hate to see it.
yeah. They're all in Anchor Point.
They're all the few who are left, and the darn government won't let them bulldoze those salmon streams
I
anymore.
know.
Dang, yeah. This is a delightful book.
So I wanted to let's jump into those influence.
Yeah,
books if
some
we
of them.
can,
Yeah, you
'cause
want to start with that?
I wanted a couple things I wanted to talk about. So first, I've said this before, but this was a book that that sort of brought me to write The Wake of the Unseen Object.
You want maybe
Bruce
just
Chatwin's in
kind
Patagonia.
of quickly describe what the Wake of the Unseen Object is for anybody.
That was travels in rural Alaska for 2 years for the Anchorage Daily News, visiting places, writing about the people. And then I took maybe 40% of those stories and turned it into a more continuous travel narrative. So in writing that book, I needed to learn how to write a travel narrative. And there were several writers who, I just kind of sunk myself into that whole genre of literary travel, which was really big at the time, in the 80s. And,
Yeah, it was.
And early 90s. And so, but this book in particular, stylistically, I actually brought this paperback with me on a couple of the trips and
Out to the bush
of my
community.
reporting trips. And I would sit in my tent and read a couple chapters, and then I'd hurl myself out into the community. And I was almost, as I would be walking down the street, I was seeing it with Bruce Chatwin's eyes rather than my own. And that spell would fade after 10 or 15 minutes.
Well, who was Bruce Chatwin, and what did he? I mean,
He was-
I've read it.
Yeah,
but
he
I
was
don't know
an
his
English writer, and turns out he did, at the time I didn't realize this, but he did make up a lot of things.
background. Jeez.
I know. But this is his account of Patagonia in South America and in Argentina and Chile. And he was describing it as a place of exile. He was visiting with a lot of the exile communities, the Welsh ranchers.
What
and
year was this? Would he have been there?
this would have been in the early 80s, I think, was the,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And 77 was the copyright. So 70s, right. So I'll read a couple of sentences here, just because you could open The Wake of the Unseen Object and hear this voice throughout, I think.
Did you share the royalties with this guy at all?
Ask for Grandpa Felipe, the lieutenant said. He's the only pure blood left. The last of the Yagans lived in a row of plank shanties at the far end of the base. The authorities settled them here, so they should be close to a doctor. It was drizzling. Snow smears came down close to the shore. It was high summer. Behind the settlement, the trees disappeared in the clouds. The water was smooth and black, and across the channel were the ribbed gray cliffs of Gable Island. The old man said I could come in. The hut was full of smoke and my eyes smarted. He sat in a pile of fish crates, crab pots, baskets, and boat gear. He was hardly taller than wide, and his legs were bowed. He wore a greasy cap and had the flat, leathery face of a Mongol, and black, unmoving eyes that registered no emotion or expression. Only his hands moved. That kind of short declarative sentence was good for me to break away from some of my early habits of going on too long and having too many conjunctions. Although I still see too many when I go back to read that. Anyway, that's my, I pay homage to that book in particular, for getting me out there and trying to think what would he see in this community that's worth seeing and registering and conveying in print. And so you did that in the newspaper stories, but then trying to string it together into a continuous narrative that was the next challenge. You know?
When was the Wake of the Unseen Object first published?
That was 91 when that came out.
Oh, yeah. I bought it at the time. I really liked that. I didn't know you then. I was still living in Anchorage at the time. And then it was recently republished by.
Redone by the university, yeah. So then, so for Pilgrim, I'm going to cite Ian McEwan, who's also English. For some reason, I didn't know why this was, and I still don't really. This is his novel Saturday, was the one that I kept going to whenever I would need to. I'd get stalled out or trying to write the Pilgrim's Wilderness, and some mornings I would just sort of start reading him until something started happening. I mean, because it was not at all about Alaska or a cultish family at all or anything, but it was the language of his sentences, and I just paragraph by paragraph and sentence by sentence, I loved it. And I was going to read one. This is really a book about science and art, in contrast and conflict. Perron is a brain surgeon, so there's some amazing pages about brain surgery.
And this is a fiction.
And
novel.
it's a fiction. This is a novel. I'm sorry. Yeah, and he's trying to figure out his life in one day, on this one Saturday, in relation to his wife, who's a lawyer, and his daughter, who's a writer, and his son, who's a musician. And it is more episodic. It's just the book right after his novel Atonement, which was a big hit,
yeah.
and had much more of a sort of momentum in the plot. But there's one point here where it's just a couple sentences, but it's where he's talking about what he sees in brains, why he gets so absorbed as a surgeon in his work. And what I realized is that he's really talking also about what it's like to be a novelist and to get lost in your work as a novelist, as a writer. Perron did he's had several pages of description of brain surgery, and he's very tired at the end of the day, but he wasn't tired from the brain surgery itself. And he says, Perron did the head dressing himself, and when he finally came away from the theaters, he wasn't feeling tired at all. Operating never wearies him. Once busy within the enclosed world of his firm, the theater and its ordered procedures, and absorbed by the vivid foreshortening of the operating microscope, as he follows a corridor to a desired site, he experiences a superhuman capacity, more like a craving for work, and to me, that's what it's like when you're writing, it's going well.
Right.
You're like, you
Right.
look up and 3 hours have passed, right?
And when it's not going well, it's like surgery without anesthetic.
Well, then he goes, yeah. Then he's going over, the next page, he has to fill out his reports at the end of the
geez,
day.
That's painful.
Yeah. And suddenly he's plagued by an unfamiliar lack of fluency. He prides himself on speed and a sleek, wry style in his writing. It never needs much forethought at other times. Typing and composing are one, but now he's stumbling. And though the professional jargon didn't desert him, it's second nature, his prose accumulated awkwardly. Individual words brought to mind unwieldy objects, bicycles, deck chairs, coat hangers, strewn across his path. He composed a sentence in his head, then lost it on the page, or typed himself into a grammatical cul-de-sac and had to sweat his way out. Whether this debility was the cause or the consequence of fatigue, he didn't pause to consider. He was stubborn and he pushed himself to the end.
That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ron Carlson was a writer I admire, mostly short story writer, and he was a great teacher. And he said time and again that you get the best writing done when you're really having a hard time, but you make yourself keep writing, which I have never been able to do. I get up and go get something to eat. I gain weight when I'm not writing well. I can't do that. I can't push on. You have another one?
Well, yeah, I have one more for the new one. For Cold Mountain Path. The book was Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson, a novella. It's set in the Pacific Northwest in the 1920s mostly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And it's all told through the kind of unreflective eye of a guy working in the woods, and but he's somehow able to convey the feeling of the magic going out of the landscape over that time.
Well, there's logging and railroads. Mostly,
Yeah,
right?
and the coming of civilization. So in a way, there was that theme that I was working at in Cold Mountain Path, and so this was, and I was just going to read one short section. It's even though it's very straightforward in its style, it's kind of almost right on the edge of a kind of magic realism at times. And
Oh, it is. That book is very dreamy.
yeah, especially when he loses his wife and child in a huge forest fire.
Yeah.
And years later, he goes back to that land, rebuilds on the land, and his wife comes to him as a ghost.
Yeah.
And tells him or conveys to him the story of how she died in that forest fire, trying to escape it. And if you have a cabin in Alaska and you've often wondered what would happen if there was a wildfire out here, and what would it be like? This little paragraph here that I'm going to read is an amazing portrait of a cabin in a forest fire. It starts with Gladys, his wife. After she's died, she floated past it all, no longer in the water where she drowned, but now overhead, seeing everything in the world. The moss on the shingled roof of her home curled and began to smoke faintly. The logs in the walls stressed and popped like large bore cartridges going off. On the table by the stove, a magazine curled, darkened, flamed, and spiraled upward and flew away page by page, burning and circling. The cabin's one glass window shattered. The curtains began to blacken at the hems. The wax melted off the jars of tomatoes, beans, and Canada cherries on a shelf above the steaming kitchen tub. Suddenly, all the lamps in the cabin were lit. On the table, a metal-lidded jar of salt exploded, and then the whole structure ignited like a match head.
That's beautiful. Yeah, terrifying, but beautiful. Yeah, we built in the woods at Anchor Point there. We had about 3 acres of heavily wooded land in the 80s, and built a cabin in there. And Lynn, my wife Lynn, is like on a first name basis with each tree. So I was not allowed to cut any trees down, so they kind of fit the thing in between them. And even after it was completed, I mean, we had to take out a few at some point, but they were mourned. And the trees were very close to the house all the time. And people who knew better would just come and shake their heads saying, yeah, you out of your mind? You're supposed to be, the rule of thumb was like keep 75 feet of grass or something between you and the trees. Well, we had like 75 inches maybe, in some places. I don't even think so.
And then what happened when the Beatles came?
Well, I fought with them. I mean, we went to war with the spruce beetles for years. We hired one of the Tillians. I don't know which is one of the sons.
Willie.
Willie. Yeah, he came in with had a bucket truck and a sprayer and a beautiful big blue tick hound or some
So you really fought it the whole time.
Oh yeah, we paid a lot of money to have them sprayed, the ones closest to the house. And then every spring, anything that died over the winter, that's how you could tell with the beetles. They would infest the tree in the summer, and then over the winter the tree would die. And then in the spring they'd be brown or orange. And we cut those down. I spent a lot of time cutting down trees when I could have been building the house
Or writing books.
or writing books.
I know.
No, but that was a great way to avoid writing.
Yeah.
I built a whole house avoiding writing.
So do you have you had books that or writers who you've gone to sort of when your well seems dry and you sort of read
Yeah.
them and find some inspiration in what you're doing, even though it's
I
something
go back
different?
to Chekhov frequently. That's the one that I love checking of all the Russians. I mean, I like to read the Russians, but because I resist reading novels, I mostly favor the Russians who write short stories, and Chekhov was the greatest in that respect. So I do.
But his stories are kind of ambiguous, wouldn't you say?
The stories are completely ambiguous.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they just, wow, there's no absolutes in those at all. He just didn't make judgments at all. One of the things I'd like to talk about that has some effect on me is even more contemporary writers and people we know. Like this is a book by my friend Nancy Lord that I always talk about whenever I get a chance to talk about good books. It's called The Man Who Swam with Beavers. And it's again, no surprise, it's a collection of short stories, and I like it. But one of my favorites within it is this delightful story called The Woman Who Would Marry a Bear. And it's a preposterous story with a crazy premise that verges on magical realism to the extent that one of the trademarks or hallmarks of magical realism in the vein of Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende, the South Americans, was that the story would be a normal, realistic story. Everything about it would be realistic except for one thing. Like there would be a very old man with enormous wings. And it's a town, a village in Mexico in which a very old man was found lying in the mud one day, but except he had huge wings. So he's apparently an angel, although no one's sure of that. And they have to deal with them. And what do you do with a homeless old man? And they try to feed him, and they make a shed for him, and they stick him in it. So basically, they have an angel in a chicken coop as the story goes on. And this is a story in which a woman is about to marry a bear. And there's no explanation for that. No one in the story seems to think that's odd. Her friends all come for the bridal shower and bring her gifts and stuff. And so everything goes on as normal, except that the bridegroom, the one she's engaged, fiance, is a 600-pound bear. And here's how it starts. The bride-to-be sat at her kitchen table with Bride's magazine, turning down pages and making notes on a pad of paper. There were so many decisions to be made, so many details to attend to. Naturally, she wanted everything about her wedding to be perfect, the bear notwithstanding. Naturally, she wanted everything about her wedding to be perfect. Suzanne, her name, looked in the magazine at the photos of a cherry blossom wedding, bridesmaids in dotted Swiss and pink butterfly bows. They were heavenly. The armfuls of blossoms, the flower girls with pink cheeks and more blossoms tucked into their golden hair. Her two little nieces were dark, and to tell the truth, sort of sour looking. But that was what she had to work with. It's this offhand comment that, oh, well, she had to work with that. So it's like nothing's going to stop her from getting married. And you get that's the joke here, that once a bride, a girl, sees herself as a bride, and she's going to get married, nothing, not even the 600-pound grizzly bear of a husband, is going to stop her. And so it goes on like that. There was some shuffling and snuffling noises began at the rear of the house. She heard the back door creak, movement through the hall. A bear entered the kitchen and rose up on his hind legs before the kitchen counter. Suzanne continued paging through her magazine. She's completely undaunted by this. And you start to giggle when you read this, because you're in on this joke with the author. He was a magnificent bear, 600 pounds of muscle and thick fur, sun-flecked fur. When he stood at the counter, his back to her, the fur of his massive back parted down the middle of a dark stripe that ran from the base of his head to his triangular tail. He placed one heavy paw on the counter, pinning a bag of Doritos, and tore the opening. You just see him put his paw on and rip that bag open. I said, Tom opens chips like that sometimes. No, he's single. He lives alone. He could do it. And Suzanne says, without even looking, don't make a mess there, she says to him, to the bear. And so the whole thing is like that. When they go to the florist shop, she's picking out flowers. He meets her there, the bear, her fiance. And she says, well, honey, what do you think of this? And she turns out he's eating flowers, you know, and it's oblivious to everything except the fact that she's going to have a perfect wedding. So there's a kind of cautionary tale in it. And I love that kind of writing because it kind of lets you in on this, that this is not to be entirely serious. This is a story from a collection I've put together. I have a dozen Alaskan stories that I'm about to try to get published. And I mean, the stories have all been published in magazines, but I need to get the book out there. And this is called Uncommon Weather. So this is my idea of a climate change story, which I wrote some years ago now. But you'll see it has this kind of, not as preposterous as this, but a little bit of a sardonic edge to it. What's on my mind, the narrator. So what I want to talk about all happened last February, a month that used to mean bone hard winter this far north, but not anymore. All that afternoon, warm Chinook winds bashed the cabin turned house my husband Herb and I have called home for 22 years. This is a female narrator, the only one I've ever written. Unseasonable rain slashed the windows and drenched the sagging snow berms along the driveway. Still, Herb was out there in it, splitting firewood with the heavy maul. Never mind that we had a brand new oil-fired furnace, part of our plan to enjoy ourselves a little, now that our twins, Megan and Joan, were off at college in Anchorage. We'd finally gotten running water, our first indoor toilet, a hot water tank, a washer and dryer, and a pink fiberglass bathtub big enough for two. All the planet-destroying luxuries I've always longed for. We figured we were due, living all those years without. Before, if we had had a carbon footprint at all, it would have shown as 5 skinny toes and a naked heel. Now it was our turn not to give a shit. Herb had finally hit the jackpot in the herring roe fishery and decided that with the girls gone, I might enjoy some creature comforts to take the edge off being alone in the cabin so much while he's away fishing. Unfortunately, I'd already come to the same conclusion, and one of the comforts I treated myself to was named Jimmy, a guy from my yoga class. Well, as you can see, this couple's got a few problems greater than the weather. There's some point in there where there's another, I got a good laugh out of the yoga joke, but there's another one in here where she says, I never meant to hurt Herb. I want to come out right out and say that now. I never meant to hurt Herb with that whole affair, but when seeing Jimmy, a single man alone at yoga is a call for help if I've ever heard one. So I like that kind of humor. Nancy's humor cracks me up. One time we were in I don't know, it was a conference or maybe at the college or something, and Nancy had at the microphone and she was talking about writing. And she said, dead serious, she said, I always wanted to be funny. And of course, everyone in the room cracked up laughing. Right? Like it was the most crazy idea in the world. Well, Nancy is hilarious. She keeps it under wraps. This is by Jim Harrison, a book called Dalva. Harrison is one of my favorite writers. He died just a couple of years ago. Wrote numerous novels and novellas, never short stories to my chagrin. But this is beautiful narration, the kind of thing that I would read to get inspired to write, even though I couldn't ever write like Harrison. It's dated Santa Monica, April 7th, 1986. It was today, rather yesterday, I think, that he told me it was important not to accept life as a brutal approximation. I said, people don't talk like that in this neighborhood. We were trying to watch, then what the heck was it where everyone talked in aphorisms and portentous, the dialogue was.
Rings of Power.
What was it?
Rings of Power.
Oh, the new Rings of Power, the Lord of the Rings thing. Yeah, it was like every conversation was, well, in all of men's memory, no such thing has ever surpass the, and you're like, wow, this goes on. Like nobody ever talks like a normal person. So this line made me laugh. People don't talk like that in this neighborhood. The fly that flies around me now in the dark is every fly that ever flew around me. I'm on the couch, and when I awoke, I thought I heard voices down by the river, a branch of the Niobrara River, where my sister and I, where with my sister I was baptized in a white dress. A boy yelled, "Water snake!" And the preacher said, "Get thee out of here, snake!" And we all laughed. The snake drifted off in the current, and the singing began. There are no rivers around here. Turning on the lamp above the couch, I see that he's not here either. I can hear a car screeching on the coast highway, even at this late hour, early hour. There are always cars. The girl in a green bathing suit was hit 7 times before the last car tossed her in a ditch. The autopsy said California speedball. Her suit was the color of winter wheat, as I remember it, almost unnaturally green when the snow melted. It was so nice to have another color on earth other than brown grass, white snow, and black trees. Now between the cars, I hear the ocean, and the breeze lifts the pale blue curtains with a sea odor, the same as my skin. So you hear the guy, this beautiful lyrical writer, good poet. And there's somebody, I like to read poetry sometimes when
You read poetry when you're working
yeah,
on a story?
I do, because I try to stay away from reading contemporary writers when I'm writing, because I tend to copy everything I hear. You know, I'm a horrible mimic. And if I read some popular book that comes out, I'll end up writing like that, which I don't want to do. So I'll either read poetry, which, you know, not going to turn up in my prose, or I'll read the old guys. Right now I'm reading David Copperfield. So I'm still working my way through Dickens. I just read Nicholas Nickleby not long ago. And I'll read Tolstoy or Chekhov, because I'm not going to write like those guys. You know,
I'm not that scared of copying, you know, like sometimes that can be
You
good.
have no shame.
You
Tom.
can learn. Yeah. But I mean, because I know I'll go back and rewrite it 15 times
Right, yeah.
after
There's
that.
There is
But
that, right.
If that helps me get some idea down, how would Dennis Johnson from Train Dreams, how would he write this scene? I'll sort of try to imitate how I imagine he might do it. And that can help me get it down on paper. And then later, the next week I'm going through and things don't sound right, I'll make adjustments, but at least I've got something to work with then. So I'm not as scared of that. I mean, I know what you mean about, especially if you're like writing on a deadline, you don't want to be writing in somebody else's
I'm never writing on the
voice.
deadline.
But, yeah.
You know, the thing is that every writer has their own neuroses
And that's what we're here to talk about.
yeah,
Right?
right. Yeah.
Can I ask a
Ian,
question?
question. Oh, let's open it to
Yeah.
questions. Yeah.
So I'm very curious, listening to your descriptions. Do you have the ending in mind? Do you have a structure and a framework? Do you write parts and put them on the framework, or do you write parts and then see how they might be put together? How do you go about making a book and the things that you've done?
Well, you know, I think I was writing parts in the Cold Mountain Path, and then trying to, over time, figure out how to turn those pieces into a page-turning narrative. With the Pilgrim book, it was almost a matter of learning how to take out things that didn't belong in there. You know, it was interesting that maybe I told this in December, but when I was writing the Pilgrim book, I was frustrated that my editor in New York wouldn't read the chapters as I was producing them. But he said, if I do that, then I'll become invested in how you're telling the story. And I really want to be free to make a judgment when I see it. all completed. And so I wrote the whole manuscript and sent it off to him. And then he wrote back a few days later and said an email, like the darkest email, second darkest email I ever got. And it was, he said, I've made it as far as chapter 7 and I'm going to stop here. And it wasn't working, you know, and so he had a very good point. You know, I was trying to, at that point, tell the story chronologically. So, you know, the John Gardner line about there are two plots. There's, you know, hero goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And this was a stranger comes to town plot, you know, and it started with this amazing family showing up in a ghost town, and how the community responded and how very slowly the truth was revealed. And it was too slowly, you know, so it was great. He said it was good for a chapter or two, but as a reader, he wasn't going to keep going, you know, to the middle of the book before the big reveal happened. So I had to go back and restructure everything, do a new, you know, opening where the daughters are escaping and leave that as a cliffhanger, and then kind of do an alternate timeline of here's what's happening with the stranger coming to town, and here's what the history was before they got there. And so that was, I mean, that's an example of me not knowing what I'm doing when I'm writing it the first time, and finding my way through. And then interesting, you know, the ending of that too, that had a kind of epilogue in Pilgrim's Wilderness, and there was I ended it in a weird place, that there was an epilogue was little sections, and the editor said, no, there's 3 seconds before the end. This is where you need to end the book. And he was so right. And, you know, and that's been, I think, one of the things that people have commented most on the book was the way that the ending lasts, that sort of lands the last line. And I can't believe that I didn't see this and that the editor saw it. But it's at Papa Pilgrim's funeral, and they were talking about him, you know, at the graveside. And after a while, Karina said, the driver from the funeral home walked away to wait behind the hearse. Apparently, he was not used to standing at an open grave and hearing speaker after speaker consign the newly departed to hell.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
You know, and it was like, oh yeah, that's a good ending.
Yeah, thank God for editors.
Yeah.
Ian, to answer your question, I have no organizations, I mean, no plan at all. The story I was just reading from called Uncommon Weather about the woman and the boy and the guy from the yoga class and so forth. It came out of a conversation when I had dinner with friends at our house. This is a long time ago. And well, we've been, yeah, at least 10 to 12, 15 years ago. I don't know when that story came out. This is a story was in the Sun magazine in maybe 2010 or something, 2009. So it's been a long time, but I remember the beginning of that story was our friends, or people our age, a little older, have been married many, many years, like Lynn and I have been married. And they got to talking and laughing. There was wine involved. They got talking and laughing about how they fight. They're very, I don't know if the word is pugilistic couple, you know what I mean? Not only fist fight, but they argue violently. Lynn and I don't do that. I just sulk and mope and feel sorry for myself. Like that. But the wife, we'll call them John and Mary. Mary said, oh, we get to the point where I don't even know what we're fighting about anymore. I'm just screaming, you, and he's yelling, you know, like back and forth. I'm not using the word to the recording here, you know, the children might run into this, but you get what I'm saying. And then we start laughing about that. So that there's no logic to the argument. It's not an argument in the geometric sense of the word, you know, where you go back and forth. And I thought that's pretty funny. So the next day I sat down and started writing a story, and it was about, that's why it was from the woman's point of view, because I heard this, my friend, the woman telling the story. And it started, the original opening line was, my husband has only 3 words for me, and the words were go yourself, you know, and that was the file was GFY and my file and my Word document. So that's all I knew was that they were fighting. And then, well, why are they fighting? Well, what could make them so angry? And I thought, well, I don't know. So I guess being a man, the most treacherous thing was that the wife was fooling around with another man. So I put that in the predictable male thinking here. And so that's how that came up with but I didn't know where the story was going. That's all I knew. As it went on, it turns out, so I'm working on the story and I got this couple fighting. Oh, I know, it was a warm winter here. And we were living at Anchor Point and it was raining out in the middle of February. So that's why I made up that thing about the rain, all that. So I got that, now I got the setting and I got these people fighting and they get this extramarital affair that happened. And I make the guy into a fisherman. I mentioned he had,
Here.
yeah, the herring fishery. He had made some money. So now well, there was a guy working with me. I had a construction related business up in Anchorage, and Mark Vail from McCarthy was working with me. And Mark was talking about in the 70s when he went out on scallop boat to fish, that they'd be out at sea for weeks without any communications. They didn't know with satellite phones in those days. And his family couldn't talk to him or anything. So that goes into the story where she didn't hear from him. My character didn't hear from her husband for weeks at a time. And then she comes to find out that in this one case, she's in the grocery store here in town, and it's described what a small, tiny store it was with all terrible produce. And this is back in, would have been the 80s, I guess, early 80s, late 70s. And she hears these 2 young men talking over the produce that they were out on, they were guys who worked on her husband's boat. And she was surprised to see him back in town because he wasn't. Her husband didn't come back from out in the Aleutians. And it turns out he chose to stay in Dutch Harbor for several weeks until they reopened the fishery for some reason. And he never told her that. So now she's feeling sorry for herself and that. And it goes on and on. So I just incorporated that something from I heard on the job. So then Lynn comes home one day and says, you won't believe the damnedest thing happened. These 2 women that we know, and she gives me the names, so these educated middle-class women. One was in the health services, and one was, I think, I don't know what the other one did. I can't remember, a lawyer maybe. Got into a big fist fight at a hockey game on the ice. They were playing in the women's hockey here in town, out on the hockey game. And I thought, wow, that's great. So now suddenly, like, no. So suddenly, she said,
it's a cold world.
Okay. So she says, she says, come on, it's over between me and that kid. And the guy said, okay, go yourself. And he says, okay, then go. So it's more, there's 5 words now. And she says, that was the most complex sentence in days. 5 words, but at this rate, it's going to be a long evening. Next line is, luckily, I had a hockey game. See, now I didn't even know she was playing. So she's in a hockey game. And then I don't know, I just made this stuff up. He says, everyone on our team, me and her friend Terry is a friend, me and Terry included, is as scrawny as a swizzle stick. Terry and I together weigh maybe 210 pounds, carrying our skate bags, our hockey sticks, and the big thermos of vodka martinis we drink before every game. So now they play hockey drunk, and I didn't see that coming either. So, and she says, honey, I'm going to the game. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. I'm going to the game, and her prodded the fire with the wood stove, and la 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 la. And I said, Terry and I are going out for pizza after the game. Maybe late. Herb opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I said, yeah, honey, I know. I'll go myself. I'll see you later, hon. And she goes out into the game. And then she gets in a big fight in the game. And so to answer your question, and there's no plan. And it turned out to be a very sad story. It started out to be a comical, ridiculous story. And it was a story about loneliness. Ultimately, she's really lonely. Her kid's gone off to college. Her husband's out at sea all the time. And
I'll just add one more thing, because you get to make stuff up, and I don't know, I have to use the.
Oh, you guys make stuff up. You just don't admit it.
No. During a lifetime, and this was in my introduction, the homesteader Jim Edwards was renowned as an inventive recycler of Kennecott's past. his pile of scavenged steel and iron, Kennecrap in the local lingo, was second to none. I know I'm only going to ever use 10% of all this, he once said. The problem is, I don't know which 10%. In that spirit, I dedicate this local history to him. So in answer to you, you know, I had to like acquire this huge pile of Kennecrap and then figure out, you know, what could I make into a sculpture and what did I have to leave?
That is
out.
a different problem, but that's a real problem. I mean, you've
It's
got all
a
this
real
other
problem.
material.
That's what I
Yeah,
spent
wow.
3 years working on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I think so.
exactly that.
Yeah, Jessica, what's up?
I was wondering what you're working on now.
Um,
Or are you taking a break? I was wondering what projects they're working on now or if they're taking a break.
What are we working on now? I'm working on containing my cat. I had to buy some fence wire to put around at the top of the porch because she learned how to climb up and jump out into the yard off the porch. But other than that, I am working on a new novel. Tom mentioned the two basic types of novels. There's The Stranger Comes to Town or The Hero Leaves Home novel. You know, the story, Hero Leaves Home is like Frodo Baggins going off to Mordor and all that stuff. Luke Skywalker was the hero leaves home. Well, the Hunger of Crows was The Hero Leaves Home. Carla had to leave her home in Arizona to flee the bad guys and ends up in Homer. But my new novel is A Stranger Comes to Town. It's a story of a 56-year-old man here, single, old, divorced man whose 15-year-old granddaughter comes to live with them. And she comes, it's a classic case of a Homer story that I've heard many times from Lynn, who worked at the high school, of children sent up here from one divorced parent to live with the other half of the divorce because the single parent down there in the lower 48 couldn't put up with the kid any longer, who was a cute baby, but a miserable teenager. Ever hear of that? And so that's the Stranger Comes to Town story that I'm working on. Tom, what are you working on?
Actually, I've got a pretty amazing story. I'm sort of prying open here. A few years ago, a friend of mine, I was having dinner with old high school friends back in New Jersey, and my friend's wife said, "Oh, Alaska. My great grandmother was born in Alaska, and she was the first baby born in Alaska after the purchase, after it became the U.S. And because of that, she was saved from the Holocaust." And I said, "What?" And I just was in Sitka last week and found the baby on the census reports that were put together by the military in 1870. And she was not the first baby, but she was the first girl. She was the third baby. Her parents were German Jews who had come from San Francisco to help administer the transfer of Russian assets to the Alaska Commercial Company. And then they went back to Germany. But because she was born in the United States, she was able to leave in the 1930s.
Oh, good. So she could get out of Germany.
Right.
I see.
She could claim U.S. citizenship.
Yeah.
Wow, right?
Yeah. Wow. What a story.
So I've got to still pull some pieces of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. I think it needs vampires. Eventually.
It has some.
Well, Cheryl, do you want to kiss this off?
Yes, I just, first of all, I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you, Tom and Rich, both for such a wonderful evening full of fun stories, writers' inspirations, insights, and all the laughs. And I want to invite you all to take a moment to peruse through their books there that Sue has at the back table from the Homer Bookstore. And feel free to visit and share stories amongst yourselves here for a few minutes. And thank you all for coming out. If you would like to see a recording of tonight's talk, you can go on to online to see the Alaska Book Week event starting October 1st through the 8th. So you can watch this again or share it with friends. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks a lot. thank you all for coming out. That's great to see you.